Hi, you've tuned in to Radio Northern Beaches, your Listen Local station, right here on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Welcome again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. The program's Innovation Talk, and I'm Michael Lester. Since the beginning of mankind and humanity, we've suffered in a great way with many deaths through many great infectious diseases and plagues. Only think back to the 14th century, the bubonic plague killed an estimated up to a couple 100 million people, if you can believe that. Recently, in the 19th century, smallpox killed, 300 to 500 million people. These are astounding numbers. And even in the last century, 1918, the Spanish flu, we had deaths estimated up to about 100 million people. Of course, there have been many pandemics and infectious diseases since then, but one of the great stories of science has been the rise of vaccines and vaccine programs, which have saved tens, if not hundreds of millions of lives and eradicated many of these infectious diseases. I'm talking about smallpox and polio and measles and what have you, to a certain extent. Certainly saved tens of millions of lives, a great public health miracle. And of course, more recently in our own times, we've confronted the COVID pandemic with many tens of millions of deaths, but also many tens of millions of lives saved through vaccines. There does seem to be, though, a political and cultural climate around post-pandemic that has introduced a lot of anti-vax skepticism and, if you like, denial, alarming drop in the rates of vaccination needed to maintain the health of our communities and societies. I'm delighted to welcome to our program on Radio Northern Beaches Professor Raina MacIntyre. Raina's written a book, Vaccine Nation, a subtitle, Science, Reason, and the Threat to 200 Years of Progress. It's published by New South University Press in 2025. Raina is a globally acknowledged world-leading biosecurity expert. She's an epidemiologist and is the head of global biosecurity at the University of New South Wales and professor of that operation there, and the Kirby Institute as well at the University of New South Wales. She's worked and does work as a global expert with the World Health Organization on many of these infectious diseases and strategies, from COVID, but also smallpox and mpox. Raina, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
Raina, so what motivated you to write this book at this time?
Well, I think after the COVID pandemic, it became apparent that vaccination rates were dropping all around the world for a range of different reasons. And that was really starting to be noticed by 2023. Given that I've worked in the area of vaccines for a long time, I decided that would be a good focus for the book.
Right. So I guess you see this as a threat to public health. What exactly is a vaccine and how does it work? The word itself seems very illustrative of its origins, from cows, I believe.
Yes, you're right. The word vaccine comes from the Latin for cow, and it's because the first vaccine was the smallpox vaccine, and Edward Jenner, who was a British physician, realized that people who'd been exposed to cowpox seemed to be immune to smallpox. So he used material from the cowpox lesions to immunize people against smallpox. So a vaccine is basically a substance that usually comprises either a part of a virus or a bacteria, or the whole virus or bacteria that's been inactivated or that's been attenuated, so made less harmful so that it doesn't cause illness but still gives you the immunity. So there's many different methods for vaccination. The original virus that used in the smallpox vaccine was a live virus, but it wasn't smallpox. It was a related virus that gave you immunity to smallpox. So and the TB vaccines are the same. The BCG vaccine is a bacteria that's related to TB, but it's not TB. And so the vaccine gives you immunity against TB. So the idea of a vaccine is it tricks your body into thinking that you've been exposed to the infection, and so you develop immunity to the infection, but the vaccine itself doesn't give you that disease, but it gives you the immunity.
A vaccine gives you immunity. So in a sense, it's not a cure for something that prevents you catching this infectious disease. Is that right? That's the vaccine?
So that's called primary prevention, where you get an intervention, in this case a vaccine, that prevents a future disease that may or may not occur, depending on, a whole lot of factors to do with you and where you live and so on. But it's a population health intervention. So, for instance, infants get vaccinated against a range of diseases like whooping cough and diphtheria and tetanus and measles, mumps, rubella, etc. And those children may not get measles or diphtheria or whatever it is if they didn't have the vaccine. But if everyone stopped being vaccinated, then we would expect these diseases to start reappearing.
At the heart of this immunity idea, I guess, through vaccination is prevention by building up immunity in enough of the population so that an infectious disease is not somehow communicated from one person to the other, people who mightn't be vaccinated and then who could suffer the really profound effects.
That's right. And that's called herd immunity, where enough people in the population are vaccinated to even protect the people who are not vaccinated. So, and that depends on how infectious the virus or the bacteria is. If it's something really highly infectious like measles, which is amongst one of the most infectious viruses we know, one person can infect another 15 people. You need very, very high levels of vaccination to stop the spread of measles. And we had achieved that in Australia with rates of vaccination close to 95%, but those rates are starting to drop down to about 90, 91%, depending on what metrics you look at. So there's now a risk that we could start seeing large measles epidemics again.
Is there only some sort of concept of, if you like, a natural herd immunity in the absence of vaccines?
No, people talked about it during the COVID pandemic, but no infection has ever controlled itself through people just getting repeatedly infected. Smallpox, for example, before the vaccine was introduced, continued to cause epidemics. And for hundreds of years, throughout human history, you'd have epidemics, then it would subside a bit and go away for a bit, then you'd get another epidemic, and it was like up and down, up and down. That's the kind of pattern you see with epidemic diseases. And that was what was seen with measles before we had vaccines.
The idea of the introduction of a live virus into the body, this must raise all sorts of questions on the one hand about safety as well as efficacy of a live virus infecting someone with a live virus, particularly if it's a live virus of the disease against which you're wishing to protect. This must have been a constant challenge both for the science of developing these vaccines and for the public acceptance of these things with the risks.
So I mean, the very first vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, was a live virus and still is a live virus. So, and that led to the eradication of smallpox. It took about 100 years after the vaccine came on board to eradicating smallpox, but that was a deadly disease where 1/3 of people who got it died from it. Other common vaccines that are live are the chickenpox vaccine and vaccines against measles, mumps, and rubella that are given as a combined vaccine, MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, and they're extremely safe. They've been tested in, clinical trials and also in large observational studies in whole populations, and they are, very safe vaccines.
I understand one of the contemporary developments in vaccine technology, if you like, and I think we saw this a great play in the COVID, didn't we, was the development of vaccines using a different technology. Was it called mRNA? And does this imply that this doesn't work as a vaccine in the same way? It's not the same sort of an animal as a live virus?
It's a different technology to the many different technologies we have for vaccines that I've already hinted at. There's many, many different ways in which we can give people a vaccine. A common way is a protein-based vaccine, where an influenza vaccine is an example, where we give the vaccine. The vaccine contains just a single or two proteins from the virus, not the whole virus, so it's not live, it can't make you sick. And those proteins from the surface of the virus are enough to give you the immunity that you need. Now, the mRNA vaccine works by giving you the genetic code for making those proteins in your own body that can then give you the immunity that you need. And, we all have mRNA in every one of our cells. It's called messenger ribonucleic acid. And basically it is like instructions to a 3D printer on what to print. So for, hair cells and muscle cells and whatever, other physical part of the body that we need to produce cells for. There is mRNA code that tells us the little thing called the ribosome inside the cell, which can be thought of as a 3D printer, what to print. So these vaccines provide the code for the protein on the surface of the COVID vaccine, of the COVID virus, that gives you immunity and tells your body to create that protein. The research on mRNA had been going on for decades before that, and there were already a few groups around the world looking at vaccines based on mRNA technology. And then when the COVID pandemic occurred, that research was turbocharged, and large clinical trials were conducted to get those vaccines into the population.
What was the advantage of this new technology as against older approaches to the vaccine in the COVID situation?
Well, based on the clinical trial data that was provided for all the different types of COVID vaccines, these had a much higher, quite a substantially higher efficacy against infection than the other vaccines. For example, the AstraZeneca vaccine wasn't as effective in preventing COVID as these mRNA vaccines. So they provided a higher level of protection, but for all of the COVID vaccines, regardless of the technology used, the protection doesn't last a long time, so the immunity starts to wane. So this is why people need a booster.
What about the impacts of that technology on the speed and cost?
Oh, sorry, yep, that
with
was your
which this
question.
technology was able to develop it? Was that a striking
Yeah,
feature of this new technology?
it's very fast. It technically, theoretically, it could take just 6 weeks to get a new vaccine for a new variant of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID. And this virus, mutates really fast. So we've had to update the boosters every year to match what the new mutations of the virus. And that can be done relatively fast. Some of the older, about 6 weeks. Some of the older technologies take a lot longer, take months. So, for example, flu vaccines, if we were to have an influenza pandemic, the traditional methodology for making flu vaccines, it would take minimum 4 months to get vaccines available to protect people. And in 2009, we had our last flu pandemic. In Australia, we had the first cases in May, and it took until September before we had vaccines to give people. But the pandemic itself peaked in August, so most of the cases couldn't be prevented because we didn't have a vaccine in time. On the other hand, mRNA vaccines, you could technically have the vaccines ready in 6 weeks. So you could save a lot more lives in a pandemic situation because you could get it out faster.
Our guest here on Community Radio Northern Beaches, our program Innovation Talk, is Professor Raina MacIntyre, who's an epidemiologist, excuse my stumbling on the word I always do, who's the Professor of Global Biosecurity at the University of New South Wales. And we're discussing her book, Vaccination, Science, Reason and the Threat to 200 Years of Progress with Vaccines. Just to return again to the question of these mRNA vaccines that really surfaced during the COVID and to great positive impact, the production process is different too, isn't it? Both in scale and nature compared to trying to produce live viruses and what have you?
Yes, the production process also can be scaled a lot quicker. Certain, like the old technologies, for flu vaccines and flu pandemics are something we're quite worried about. The technology, it's made in eggs, in hen's eggs, and it's quite slow and rate limited, and the pandemic virus might even kill the eggs, so you end up with less vaccine dose than you hoped for. So it's quite a laborious process, but the mRNA technology overcomes all of that.
Yeah, and presumably can be done on a smaller scale in more distributed locations, or is that not necessarily true?
It just depends on the country and whether you have mRNA manufacturing capability, and we do now, which is good. We've got an mRNA capability in Victoria. There is also a capability in New South Wales and Queensland. In terms of vaccine manufacturers, Moderna has a capability in Melbourne.
It's a new technology, although you say it's been around for a long time, but perhaps not in the context of vaccines, I don't know. But the very fact that people might see this and interpret it as a genetic modification of what's going on within their own body, manipulating the genes and cells in their own body to produce whatever it is that's going to immunize them this time, this could make people very concerned and perceive greater risks to what's happening to them. What's the strength of that and concern, if any?
Yeah. So there certainly are side effects of all of the COVID vaccines. The least safe of them probably was the ones that were built on adenovirus vectors, which include the AstraZeneca, Janssen, etc., because that caused a blood clotting side effect that it was rare, but it was particularly in younger people. And so there were, most of the deaths in Australia from COVID vaccines were from that vaccine. There were 14 deaths altogether in Australia from COVID vaccines, from millions and millions of doses given, and only one of those was from an mRNA vaccine. The others were all AstraZeneca. That gives you an idea of the relative safety. The other common side effect the other common serious side effect is with mRNA vaccines is inflammation of the heart, myocarditis or pericarditis, which tends to happen in younger males, particularly teenage or adolescent boys or young adult males. But again, it's extremely rare. It's like in the order of 2 to 6 per 100,000 vaccinations, and it tends to be more common after the first dose. So most people can have it safely, and if you've had myocarditis or pericarditis, most cases resolve without event. And otherwise, the side effects are a sore arm and fever, feeling achy and unwell after the vaccine, like with many vaccines.
Now, the distribution and use of vaccines is a key component, pillar, or element, if you like, isn't it, of an integrated public health delivery system in a country to achieve the scale and distribution and impact and efficacy and everything. And yet, it seems that one of the things that happened during the COVID was that they developed a certain skepticism and loss of trust or lack of trust, and certainly since then, in the public health system as such. What elements of a public health system are important to the effective delivery of a vaccine, in this case, say in the COVID element, and what led to some of the problems that has led to this skepticism and lack of trust?
So, I think overall, except for a delay in rolling out the vaccines, we did reasonably well, and the states certainly set up very big capabilities, like in New South Wales, the Olympic site became a vaccine hub, so people could go through and get vaccinated on a large scale. I think disinformation and misinformation spread on social media is one of the big factors in loss of confidence, in that it's global and it's instantaneous. So whatever is on, your different social media platforms, you're getting it instantly in real time from all over the world. And it's very hard. Some of it looks very pseudoscientific, and it's very hard to separate out what's true and what's not true. So I think it's true to say people have been bombarded with a range of information on vaccine safety and on vaccines. Some of it is disinformation and misinformation. Some of it is correct information, but there hasn't been probably enough sort of strong messaging from governments anywhere to counter that. I think the other thing that's happened is, the COVID pandemic was very triggering for a lot of people, lockdowns and all of the things that happened with COVID. People lost their livelihoods, certain industries were unable to go back to work. And so any mention of COVID is enormously triggering for a lot of people. And so governments generally avoid talking about it because it's so triggering, and it's not going to be electorally popular to talk about COVID. So we've had this proliferation of misinformation and disinformation and very little kind of formal pushback from official sources to try and counter that.
Aside from the concerns that people gave rise to about the safety and efficacy of vaccines and the rest of it, and the anti-vaxxers per se, it was very closely linked, though, wasn't it, with the delivery through the public health system, and particularly measures that were seen to restrict private liberty, freedom of movement, with the lockdowns and the masks. But how important were those sorts of broader public health measures and restrictions to the effective adoption of a vaccine strategy?
So in the early stage of a pandemic, there is no vaccine. There was no vaccine. So you need all the non-pharmaceutical measures like masks and, social distancing, etc., to stop it from spreading, because at that point, the rates of ICU admission and death are very high. And Australia also closed the borders. Other countries that didn't do that saw, huge importations of COVID that then just set up huge epidemics. And remember, New York, Barcelona, etc., seeing the bodies piling up and hospitals unable to cope, etc. We avoided that. So the non-pharmaceutical measures have a greater importance earlier before you've got your vaccines. And then when the vaccines come out, the thing is, this is the first time in anyone's living memory that there's been a vaccination program for everybody. In 2021, everyone had to get vaccinated. If you wanted to go to the cinema after the mitigations were ceased towards the end of 2021, or if you wanted to get on a flight, if you wanted to go to certain jobs, you had to have a vaccine certificate. So that's the first time most people had ever experienced that. They were essentially mandated in a lot of settings, and you had to show a certificate. And 95%, just under 95% of all Australian adults got the first 2 doses of COVID vaccines. So that in itself would have been a shock to many people, because normally vaccines are for babies and for older adults and for people in between who have certain medical risk factors. But here we had healthy young people needing to go and get a vaccine, and I think understandably there was pushback against that.
You characterize what's happened during COVID, for whatever reasons, as the mainstreaming of anti-vaccine sentiment. What was the nature of this mainstreaming, and why did it happen?
So I think, one of the issues is the flood of disinformation and misinformation, as well as increase in the number of pseudoscientific publications in medical journals that look like they're legitimate but actually aren't. That's another whole story about the rise in predatory publishing and journals. Essentially, it's the case today that anyone with an agenda who wants to, prove, in inverted commas, anything can get a publication, in some journal. And I've seen doctors passing around on email, journal articles from these dodgy journals, thinking that they're legitimate. So doctors and health professionals have been flooded with a lot of disinformation and misinformation through what looks like, official publishing channels, but which actually are dodgy, unscientific journals. And again, there's been very little effort to counter that. So they've been left to their own to kind of try and figure it out. And it's such a big and complex field. You've got to keep up with all the medical literature to really get your head around all the facts and figures around it. And most doctors working in a GP practice or wherever, they don't have the time to do that. And I gave the example in the book about evening I spent in the emergency department, and the person in the cubicle next to me, I was waiting to be seen, and the person in the cubicle next to me had an animal bite, and the doctor told them they needed a tetanus injection, and they were really upset about that and said they didn't want a tetanus shot and just give them some antibiotics. And the doctor tried to say, you don't need antibiotics, you just need a tetanus injection. But then this guy said, I know 30 people who died. I'm not having it. And the doctor said, died of what? And he said, COVID vaccines. And remember, I just told you in the whole of Australia, there were only 14 deaths from COVID vaccines. And this guy in, one suburb thinks that 30 people he knows have died of COVID vaccines. So the doctor didn't have the information at their fingertips to give any sort of counter argument or tell him that that was really unlikely that all those people who he knew who died had died of COVID vaccines, and instead just gave him the antibiotic. She didn't have the energy or the inclination to argue with him. So that, to me, I don't think that was some statistical aberration. I think what I was seeing is what's going on in the community out there. The degree of disinformation and what an impact it's had on ordinary people, and the inability of the medical profession to actually sort through what's real and what's not real and provide reasonable advice to their patients.
One wonders, though, beyond the post-truth sort of world of media and social media, to what extent this reveals a certain politicization of views about science, and in this case, medical science, and maybe scientists and doctors themselves, falling into concerns about the political environment they're operating in.
Yeah, very much so. So we've seen polarization of basic, simple public health measures along political lines. And I think vaccines have got conflated with everything else, with lockdowns, with masks, and, seen as a tool of government control and coercion, and very difficult to come back from that, pushback.
As we wind up here with our guest on Radio Northern Beaches, Raina MacIntyre, Professor of Biosecurity at the University of New South Wales, we're talking about the threats to 200 years of progress with vaccines in her latest book, Vaccination. The future of vaccines, My understanding is that vaccines primarily developed in the control of infectious diseases and whatever. But is it true that the opportunities forward are also opportunities for developing vaccine approaches to more chronic diseases around heart attacks and more chronic conditions like cancer?
Yes, yes. I mean, in the last few years, we've just discovered through research that's been published in the medical literature that Epstein-Barr virus, which is a type of, quite a common virus, is probably one of the main causes of multiple sclerosis. That's an important discovery. And so vaccines are being developed against Epstein-Barr virus, which then could prevent multiple sclerosis. We've had cancer preventing vaccines for a long time. Hepatitis B is a major cause of liver cancer, and certain countries have really high rates of liver cancer, and most countries started implementing hepatitis B vaccination 20 plus years ago, and we're seeing a drop in liver cancer rates following that. Human papillomavirus, or HPV, is the cause of cervical cancer, which before Pap screening was the leading cause of death in women. Not breast cancer, it was cervical cancer. Now it's a rare cancer in Australia, and we're now seeing the data coming out of different countries, including from the UK, that it's pretty much, vaccinating adolescent girls has pretty much got rid of those pre-invasive cancerous lesions and really removed that risk of cervical cancer even further. So those two vaccines have been around for a long time, but there's many more developments, particularly with mRNA technology of cancer vaccines, including vaccines to treat cancers like melanoma after you've been diagnosed with melanoma, which is an important cancer in Australia with, as a sun exposure related cancer in some cases, where, if it's just like a couple of millimeters thick, it might be too late to stop it spreading. And it's a deadly cancer that, kills a lot of young people. There's now an mRNA vaccine for treatment of melanoma and combinations of immunotherapy plus these vaccines. And it also opens up personalized medicine, being able to tailor treatments and for individuals based on their genetic makeup, as well as things like regenerative medicine. If someone is a paraplegic or a quadriplegic or they've had a stroke, brain cells and spinal cord cells cannot regenerate. They're gone once they're damaged. But mRNA technology is now being used also to explore regenerative medicine to give hope for some of those conditions that have been incurable in the past. So I think we'll see a huge explosion in medicine and medical research that's going to change the landscape for a lot of other diseases thanks to this technology.
But presumably, because these chronic diseases you've been mentioning are not infectious diseases and not conveyed from one person to another, at least on my understanding, they might confront fewer of the problems and skepticism and anti-sentiments that we've seen expressed with infectious disease vaccines. For that reason, because the public health dimensions are not involved, or the public control dimensions. So maybe that could transform some of the attitude of anti-vaxxers, although they still might have concerns about the nature of the substances themselves. I just wonder, Raina, what about the future? There's always going to be, well, there will be another pandemic. It's only a matter of time. And then we're going to have to be faced with the similar problems. How well prepared are we? Let's take in the case of Australia.
As Australians, our culture and our values are really unique. And I think Australia is very well placed in a lot of ways because culturally, we've always been more civic minded than many countries and kind of thought about the public good, and implementation of public health measures has been more successful and easier in Australia than in many other countries. We achieve much higher vaccination rates, even with our routine vaccines, than many other countries, including the US and the UK. The lessons of COVID hopefully will also help. And if it's an influenza pandemic, then we're going to be better prepared than for something that isn't influenza like COVID, because influenza is a highly researched virus and we've already got effective vaccines against influenza. So it's just a matter of matching the vaccine to the exact pandemic strain. But in terms of clawing back what we've lost in terms of public confidence in vaccines and falling vaccination rates, etc., that's going to be a bit harder.
So I'd like to thank you very much. Raina MacIntyre, Professor of Global Biosecurity at the University of New South Wales, author of the book we've been discussing, Vaccination, Science, Reason and the Threat to 200 Years of Progress with Vaccines. Thank you so much, Raina, for joining us here on Radio Northern Beaches.
It's a pleasure, Michael.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3, now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.